So we're skipping back to chapter 9 from chapter 6, and this chapter is on social stratification, inequality, and poverty. Really critical chapter for at least 3 or 4 topics later on. Study questions, of course, are: what are inequality? Why is America so unequal? Do we all have an equal opportunity to succeed in life? And how much poverty exists in the United States and around the world? Inequality goes back throughout human history, in primitive communities, in slave states in the ancient world, in feudalism in the Middle Ages, and even during the Industrial Revolution, when it really took on new proportions. There's always been a time when some people have and some people don't have. If you just look at the per capita income around the world, like for example in Western Europe, in the year 400 it was about right at about 450. By the time we reach the 2000s, it's nearly 20,000 per capita. So compared to some people around the world, Western countries to China, for example, there's a big gap. In the last 130 years, the average income in Western Europe increased 4 times. In just 40 years, between 1950 and 1990, they increased almost 3.5 times as much, and average incomes have continued to rise since then. Quintiles are 20% groups. The top 5% U.S. estimate at about 181,000. The top quintile is above 99,000, and you can see the lowest quintile is between 0 and $20,700. So you can measure in wealth or inequality by 2 major factors: income and wealth. Income, of course, is the money that you make in a given period of time, and wealth is the net values that you have. So, for instance, a newly minted physician will make lots of money but may not have a lot of income, whereas someone like the Queen of England has a lot of wealth but really no income. And wealth includes many things, not only money, but real estate, jewelry, paintings, etc. Any net financial asset. You can see over the last 100 years how some interesting trends have occurred. So the blue line, of course, is marked by automobile ownership. Very few people had them in the 1900s, less than 5%. By the time we got up to the year 2000, nearly everyone owned a home. I think what's interesting on here is inside toilets. It would be almost unheard of by the 1970s to not have a toilet inside your house. And of course, computers came on the market in the 1980s and have gone up ever since. But along with owning things, there's also increases in household debt. So in the 1960s, the average household sector had about just under 40% of the GDP was in debt. By the 2008, it was nearly 100%. So it's a good thing people are spending, but they're also racking up debt. The unequal distribution of products and services is an essential part of everyone's everyday life. It includes the unequal distribution of health, people that are insured versus people that are not insured, or how people are very well off have all the health care that they want and need. The exposure, for example, to crime and violence. People living in good neighborhoods with policing have less of a chance of being involved in criminal or violent activity of other people. whereas people living in poor neighborhoods do. Exposure to environmental toxins, where housing neighborhoods are built on, whether it's near factories, whether it's near reclaimed land. So the poor people living in Flint, Michigan, for example, are exposed to a lot of environmental risks because of the water contamination, which was a result of the auto industry back in the 1930s through the 1960s. And even the general level of happiness. There is a relationship between having more resources and being happy to a point. So if you're making $100,000 a year, that's a lot happier than someone who's making $20,000. But just because you make $14 million a year doesn't mean that you're that much happier than a person making $100,000. So classes are comprised of people sharing similar economic situations, and it's measured by this thing called the socioeconomic status. Sometimes they come in conflict with the economic interests of other classes. So the middle class that's talked about a lot has conflict with people in the upper class. They also have similar life chances, which might include where they live at, what kind of car they drive, where they eat at, where they go to college at, and where they get their health care at. And they often have similar attitudes and behaviors, for instance, political affiliations, religious affiliations, etc. And as a group, they're more likely to engage in potential collective actions like striking or political activity. Karl Marx, of course, capitalized on his theory of conflict theory, which looked at the critical divisions between two classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. More contemporary theories base their distinction on income, socioeconomic status, and occupational prestige. That is the type of job you have. All three of those things are inextricably woven together. One group, the functionalists, justify inequality and suggest that the pay differences reflect the talents and skills that people have. So if you want to go to a surgeon, you don't want a surgeon making minimum wage, but rather reward them for their expertise and the length of training that they have. Question 2 is, why is America so unequal? That's a very difficult question to answer. What's important here is to look at the purple line, which is the top 1%. Those are people making over $350,000 a year, which is a lot of money. You saw the same thing happening back before the Great Depression in 1929. There's a big gap between the top and the bottom. The U.S. is the most unequal country in terms of distribution of wealth. The most egalitarian or equal ones include all the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark, as well as Canada. These are all social democracies. These countries have political systems in which governments help to ensure minimum standards of living for all citizens. So people in Sweden are guaranteed health care from birth to death, including nursing home care if they're elderly and need it. They're guaranteed college if they have the grades for it. And so egalitarian countries are seen as the most equal social democracies. One of the things that's made the gap in this inequality so much bigger is the distribution of technology. So the more technology you have, the more jobs are replaced or complemented. So skills-based technology is really important. In the 1970s, anyone graduated from high school could get a job pretty much anywhere they wanted to. But since then, technologies suggest that people need to improve their skills all the time. And that's even including people in skills jobs. It also occurred because of deinstitutionalization and economic restructuring. So some companies retooled their factories. They sent work off to other places where they could get cheaper labor. And of course, globalizing and outsourcing has been one change in the economic landscape around the world. It's a global economy now. You can ask the question, who's in the top 1%? If you listen to Bernie Sanders, he's always talking about the top 1%. There are people with an average income of over $344,000. And they have the material buying power of 10,000 to 1. So people in the bottom 90% have a purchasing power of 1. People in the top 400 or 400 people in the world, the top 1%, between 800 and 10,000 buying power. So money does talk. Why do we have equal opportunity, or do we have all equal opportunities to succeed? Well, measuring inequality of opportunity is a challenging research question. So equality of opportunity and equality of outcome are two different things. So this means giving people an opportunity to succeed in life. One of the ways people do that is by moving, social mobility, going from one class to another. Typically it goes from low and middle class to upper class. Generally doesn't go downward. Societies with more opportunities for upward mobility have less inequality. So you can watch this video. It takes about 6 minutes, and it will give you some idea of why the United States is so unequal, and maybe provoke some thinking about whether or not it should be. When you look at social mobility, intergenerational correlation of earnings, the United States, Italy, and France lead the world in social mobility, whereas those same countries we talked about, the Scandinavian countries and Sweden, have the least amount of social mobility. People don't need to switch classes because they're provided for with basic life needs. Things that influence mobility, why people move around, include how families work. Some families are more itinerant than others. How individuals are slotted into jobs in the labor market. Sometimes you have to look for work, which means you have to move. And sometimes government policies encourage people to move. So when there was an oil boom back in the early 2000s, people were moving to western states like North Dakota, and they were encouraged to by the government, but that's since slowed up. So education is maybe a key to social mobility. Challenges traditional forms of allocating privileged positions in society. And it maintains privilege across access to scarce positions if families with more resources are able to invest in better education. So going to a community college or going to a state school provides you different opportunities than if you went to Harvard or Princeton. So it's both good news and bad news. It has different characteristics for different people. How much poverty exists in the United States and around the world? Life at the bottom is very difficult. The poverty line is around $14,000. I don't know exactly what it is in 2020 right now. That may be changing. So it's the point at which people find it very difficult to live, both in relative terms and absolute terms. Some of the risk factors in poverty include a lack of education, a lack of employment status, and even minority status. So if you're a person of color, you're more at risk to be poor than a person who's not Black, or Hispanic. Lack of employment opportunities also puts you at risk, or for that matter, lack of education. And of course, the last one, of course, is age. Younger people and older people are more at risk to be poor than people who are middle-aged. And of course, family structures. Poverty in the United States is a real problem. The United States, generally speaking, does less than other countries to reduce poverty. If you listen to the political dialogue in 2020, one of the things that some people propose is a minimum income, where the government would pay a minimum wage to people to help meet their needs as a way of reducing the poverty in the United States. Some countries have done that relatively successfully. America's policies toward poverty reduction different than other countries, for example, the Scandinavian countries. And the U.S. spends less to directly alleviate poverty through welfare programs than other wealthy countries, and more on education and health care. Poverty affects children tremendously. It handicaps from conception extending to childhood and beyond. We talked about these early in the semester, and we called them ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, and poverty is one of them.